Hello, I'm Chris Slisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Slisher. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. As you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And my guest today is where the three of those ideas meet. It has to do with astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Spiritual adventure, as you know, is a wide net I cast that includes a lot of metaphysical topics. And today we're going to be talking about sacred geometry. And my guest is Tad Mann. Welcome to the show, Tad.
Thank you.
And he is an astrologer, an artist, an architect, and an author. And he knows quite a bit about sacred geometry, which has roots in the very nature of humanity and the very nature of the cosmos and of the earth. So if you could just give us sort of the elevator speech on what the sacred geometry is, if that's such a thing.
Well, partially it comes from a journey that I've taken in my life because from when I was very young, I wanted to be an architect. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why, because I didn't know any architects. I really didn't even know what it was. But what I always sensed was that there was something mystical, magical, or spiritual about it. And it was interesting also because when I was a kid, I climbed trees quite a lot. And I would climb up in these trees, and I'd look, especially when the leaves were gone in the autumn, and I'd look and see the sky against these tips of the branches, and I kept thinking, these stars are somehow connected, mm-hmm. that the tree branches were picking out combinations of stars, and it felt to me like I was discovering something quite unique.
Yeah.
So you know, in my late teens, I became more and more interested in architecture, and I went to Cornell University Architecture School in the early 60s. And it was very interesting because I kept expecting my professors to talk about the sacred or about geometry and what that meant. And I also thought that buildings like the Great Pyramid or Stonehenge or the great cathedrals had a mystery, that there must have been some kind of mysterious, magical quality about these buildings that ancient people knew about, but which we didn't. And, right. And in fact, the fact that it never got mentioned in 5 years of architecture school, one of the best architecture schools in America, I thought really kind of confirmed this idea. You know, we were taught about geometry and about shapes and about form and all of these issues. However, we never really attracted or attached a meaning to them.
Right, and there is a logic, there's an underlying logic in the geometry of the universe and of the world, and that we can see it in as you mentioned, in some very basic natural forms. We see it in the shape of the swirl that curls through the inside of a nautilus. We can see it in the rings of trees. We can see it in the Fibonacci numbers and how those repeating patterns, what is pleasing to the eye, are all tied to this same idea of sacred geometry and the sort of the underlying logic that ties that all together. And where do you think that came from? Is that related to the DNA strand, or?
That's what I came to believe. It's mm-hmm. not like I knew that in the very beginning, but certainly when I got out of school, I was designing buildings in New York, and I worked in Rome. And in fact, Rome was a real trigger because my interest in varying ideas began really expanding, and I became interested in Renaissance figures that were not only architects, but they were also magicians.
Right.
And that they made images that were etchings often, but some of them were mandalas, and that was an unusual concept to me. And mandalas basically are circular meditation diagrams that often include whole ranges of ideas or correspondences, and that the link between them was that they had some connection around the circle. And although, again, in the early days, I really didn't know anything about astrology, that of course astrology is the epitome of this, meaning that there are particular relationships between 12, if you divide a circle in 12 segments, there are going to be certain mathematical relationships between things, meaning if something is just opposite in the circle, it means that they oppose each other, and there's a tension to that.
And there's a tension, it's the plus and minus, it's sort of the yin and yang of the great universe.
Right, or if there's an exact triangle in a circle,
right.
then it's showing you three places that are equidistant from each other.
Right.
It's called an equilateral triangle. And so I began suddenly or gradually realizing that a lot of the basic geometrical shapes, squares, circles, and all of their subdivisions, which is essentially all of geometry, that it had very specific meaning and significance. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, I mean, one of the alchemical phrases would talk about things like as above, so below, like that somehow what's in the heavens reflects what's in the earth. And it's interesting because in early cultures, and a lot of this I talked about in my book, Sacred Architecture, that was published in the early 1990s now, 1994. But the gist of it was that the square is often associated with the feminine principle and earth, because a square is a kind of unusual shape. It's very specific to here. Whereas
hard-edged, right? Yeah.
Yeah, a circle is associated with heaven. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the early churches that you'll know about, or cathedrals, or mosques, or synagogues, or ancient temples in India, or in China, or in Japan, are almost always created on a square base with a domed ceiling. And I suddenly realized at one point, the reason they did that is because the dome ceiling is like heaven, like the dome that we see when we look up at the night sky.
Our peripheral vision.
And that because we're human and here on Earth, we're in a kind of square space or rectangular space. Mm-hmm. So the trick was that a lot of sacred geometry involves somehow and varying mixed combinations of circles and squares.
Right.
And we were talking earlier tonight about a series of mandala paintings that I made back in the 70s, in 1975, that were 12 different cultural systems: Christian, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, Zen, Taoist, Aztec, Hindu, and so on, are all composed of these same symbols. So regardless of the culture that plays with these shapes, that sacred architecture and sacred geometry in those cultures were essentially inherent patterns in how the world works.
And what's unique about them is that those cultures were not connected at the time, and yet they all had the same basic structure. So that shows that this is part of the logic of humanity, as well as the planet, as well as us as human beings, as well as the earth, and the logic of the universe. And we see it in the smallest grains to the largest grains, and the idea of that, the construct. I mean, just the simple fact that when an eclipse happens, for example, and we have an orb, the moon, which is 250,000 miles away from us, and the fact that it moves right in front of the sun and fits it over the face of the sun, which is 93 million miles away, and it fits on there exactly with precision, is a remarkable feat of engineering, I guess you could say, but it's a remarkable feat of the logic of sacred geometry. Now, you have some illustrations that might point out, when we see the ancient Kabbalah, there might be an illustration that we would see that you've brought along that would show us some of the examples of how the circles and the squares work together. Perhaps we can get one of those on the screen and we can get a better idea of how it looks. Now, there's an example right there of one of your drawings that brings into play the logic of the circle, the geometry of the square, because we see the interplay of square and circle there.
Yes, and you can see in this image, it's kind of a fascinating one, because if you look at this image, it's the Kabbalistic tree of life.
Right.
And it's based around the series of 10 numbers. And it goes all the way from that topmost circle in that inner diagram, which is Kether and heaven, mm-hmm. and the bottommost circle is Malkuth, which is earth. And the one right in the middle of that Seal of Solomon, as it's called, with an upright triangle and a downward pointing triangle, right, is called Tiphereth, which is the sun.
Okay.
And so the gist of it is, in this model, which was, by the way, radically different in medieval times, to say the sun was in the middle rather than the earth being in the middle was a big deal.
Right, and you could go to prison for that.
This would have been really, it would have earned you a hot seat, to say the least.
Yeah, life in prison at least, nothing else. That's fascinating to see that. The way the interplay of the circles and the squares as geometric figures is remarkable. And to be able to discover that and see how they play off each other. Now we know that it's very much of a key of astrology because astrology is based on the geometry. And when we see that in the circle, but the circle is that 360-degree orb, geometric figure, which is the symbolic in the mandala, as you mentioned. It's also symbolic in the shape of the Earth. And we could say it continues out throughout the rest of the universe.
We have the shape back.
Oh. So we know that it could be the same sort of process, and perhaps we get the shape back. We can see that one more time, how that the logic of the circle, because we see that circle going around. There's this shape once again, and
yeah, I'd just like to point out a couple of things. First of all, and again, and these are really very basic principles of sacred geometry, because the triangles are very significant because the four elements are made up of that symbol in the center, which we call the Seal of Solomon. It looks like a Hebrew,
Jewish star, right.
a Hebrew or Jewish star. But if you notice, you can see that there are downward pointing triangles, at the top of the diagram.
Right.
There are actually 3 downward pointing triangles. And the downward pointing triangles in this symbol system represents the feminine principle.
Oh.
But then there are also upward pointing triangles. There are 3 upward pointing triangles, or 2 upward pointing triangles, and they represent the masculine principle.
Okay, interesting, yeah.
So when you put an upward triangle and a downward triangle together, like that symbol in the very middle, that represents the upward element is fire, which is masculine. The downward pointing triangle is earth, which is feminine, water, which is feminine. And if you drew a line right across the middle of that central circle, then an upward pointing triangle with a line through it represents the element earth, and a downward pointing triangle with a line through it represents the upward pointing triangle is the element air, and the downward pointing triangle with a line through it is the element earth. So that symbol, the Jewish or Hebrew cross, represents all 4 elements combining. It brings what's above and what's below together. And this is a symbol of a person, of a human being,
right.
which is that we represent the interaction of heaven and earth. Very much like that image I mentioned before about the circle being the dome and the square being the temple itself. So the whole idea back in those days was that sacred geometry was a way of really describing and representing the relationship between heaven and earth. And that was exactly what people saw in a temple or a church or a cathedral.
So it really was a mirroring, it was man's representation of what nature was providing. It was sort of an extension of what nature provided that man was able to elaborate on.
It was a microscopic version of the cosmos.
Right. It's a microcosm of the macrocosm.
Right. So the idea was that it was thought in earlier times that the gods came from heaven, but also there were goddesses that came from the earth.
Right.
And the temple was where they met. And even places like Stonehenge, which is simply a circle of stones, in the plains in England, was a place where, because that circular image was there, it was where the gods came down and where the goddesses arose. So all of these places that are seen as, as the temple or the cathedral or the church or the synagogue, and in every other culture you have a similar kind of set of
That's what I find fascinating, because all these cultures evolved in their own little separate worlds. I mean, ancient China was not connected to Egypt. Egypt was not connected to the Aztecs at the time. Now, of course, our world is shrunken and we are all connected in all ways, but these evolved at a place in time where there was no continuity, there was no connection, which gives birth to the idea that the fact that these were all basic human elemental characteristics that were recognized by humans regardless of their race or location on the planet Earth, meaning that there is a natural order to it, there's a commonality to it, much the way Carl Jung described when he was talking about the evolution and sort of the collective subconscious. We are all part of this giant pool, regardless of our backgrounds.
Well, it's intriguing because, there's a myth of Atlantis. And a book I wrote in the 80s called The Divine Plot, or The Divine Life, I actually explored this idea because in the same way that some of these symbols are archetypal in Jungian terms, which means that they exist in every culture regardless of the time they came into being, that a lot of people believe that Atlantis was a civilization that was destroyed prehistory, before our history began, and that it spread all over the world. And that was the rationale behind thinking that squares and circles came together wherever you went in the world.
Right.
But I think, and Jung talked about this idea as well, that it's an archetypal dynamic. It's built into us. It's a pattern that's within the form of our DNA molecule, and it's within the form of how heaven and earth come together. Interestingly, this idea of the spiraling solar system and the spirals that show up in nature that are seen as being sacred and exhibit very particular geometries, that the Earth is 93 million miles away from the sun, and pi is the relationship between the radius of a circle and its circumference, or the diameter of the circle and its circumference. So if you multiply that times 3.5, the whole periphery of the Earth's path around the sun is about 365 million miles, which happens to be the number of days in a year.
Days in a year.
So actually the Earth is moving 1 million miles a day around the sun. So it's very, very interesting that these geometries come together with, and this has been discovered in recent years.
Yeah.
There's a precision to it that is so profound that it isn't just accidental, but rather we're discovering something integral. So when you look at a mandala, and you paint them as well, Chris, that when you look at a mandala, when you meditate on such images, when you pray in a temple or a cathedral or a mosque, you're actually invoking this integration between heaven and earth.
And that's fascinating because it is so universal. It draws from a wellspring of our DNA, which I think is probably a recurrent theme that goes back through the decades, through the centuries of the evolution of humankind. The idea of a collective subconscious is that there's this wellspring of knowledge that is part of our basic human intelligence, and that is a cumulative kind of pool. As we evolve further, that pool becomes deeper and larger, and we have more knowledge. I would even go so far as to say that a child born today comes with far more software, for lack of a better word, than a child born 100 years ago, because they have far more. We can see a child born today who naturally knows how to use a mouse or how to use a phone, whereas a child born 100 years ago wouldn't. You'd think that a child out of a womb would have a certain amount of innocence and could be taught anything, but it's not the case. There is a sense of logic that ties all these things together. And it's fascinating because it does show, I think what it points out more than anything else is that mathematics truly is the key to all of life.
Well, but the one distinction is that that's a belief in science as well. The only distinction is that it's symbolically true as well.
Symbolically true.
That science doesn't acknowledge symbolism.
No, it doesn't.
In fact, it sees numbers as numbers.
Right, it's very cold.
And within the symbolic world, the geometry and the numbers of things mean something rather than not meaning something. So the difference is that if you're an astronomer, the universe doesn't really mean anything. But if you're an astrologer, or if you're a metaphysician, or if you're a mystic, or if you're a human being, then I think we seek meaning in some way, and that when we discover that these various geometric shapes symbolize something and mean something, it's a whole different kettle of fish altogether.
It totally explains the story as well, though, I would say, because it does add a dimension to it, because the numbers do have meaning. If they have to have meaning, it's the symbolism that gives us the richness, the imagery of life that makes it all seem like it's all making sense. Without that imagery and that symbology, we don't have a sense of meaning, and that's part of what sacred geometry, I think, brings to it. When you refer to the idea of the Fibonacci numbers, for example, which is a formula which is what you see in the Nautilus shell, that's the perfect example of it. There's that repetitive pattern that is, if you see any piece...
1.618 to 1.
There you go. I knew you'd know that. Whenever you see that you see it in every painting, and then it's what makes the photography great. It's what makes architecture great. It's what makes all these things work, because there's a natural symbiotic relationship between our visual eyes and the symbology that's there in the underlying geometry.
Yeah, well, I did a book that was published in 2010 with a great friend of mine, the renowned landscape photographer Lynn Davis. And Lynn knows about sacred geometry, and she knows about the Fibonacci series and the golden section, as it's called,
right,
which is a very particular geometric relationship. And I noticed that looking at random at hundreds and hundreds of her landscape photographs, she instinctively chose angles, and she almost always took square images that were exactly at that golden section proportion.
So she would mirror
So,
that.
so when people are tapped into the cosmos in that way, they instinctively choose that proportion. You know, the horizon can be anywhere in a square picture. Right in the middle, it creates a funny dichotomy. It doesn't really balance. But when it's, you know, like a third of the way down or a third of the way from the top, it makes a golden section, and somehow the whole composition of the image, you know, the great filmmakers, you know, had ways of framing photographs or framing, you know, movies so that it pointed out very particular geometries that meant different things. Some of them were discordant and some of them were in accord with each other.
These are great rules that we see when we look at great photography as well, as you mentioned, because photography has that element of the rule of thirds, for example. You know, how a good photograph should be set up a certain way in order for it to be appealing and to have a sense of allure for the viewer. And photography is one of the most fantastic ways. You know when you see a good photograph, it's got those basic underlying rules that are part of it. But the Fibonacci numbers is, this is something that we find in nature. Like if you find a nautilus shell, which is a common, you know, well maybe not that common, but it's a shell you find in the ocean, and you cut it in half and you've seen it. If you just Google the word nautilus, you'll see that spiral on the inside, which is that repetitive quality of each time. That number is a phenomenal basis for the Fibonacci numbers, as well as much of what the great artwork in the world comes from.
Well, you know, another interesting factor to this is that, and this is something I became aware of when I developed my astrology technique called lifetime astrology, is that by reading a book by Uspensky called In Search of the Miraculous. Uspensky was a Russian mathematician, but also, you know, a collaborator and a student of Gurdjieff, who was a Russian mystic. And their work was very profound, and it had a huge impact on me. And part of what I brought from their way of looking at things to astrology is that when you apply these proportions to time, something else happens, which is that the time in our life is not linear, meaning 1 year is not the same perceptually when you're 1 year old or 10 years old or 20 or 30, because as we all know, time moves faster and faster as we get older. It compacts, it contracts, and it moves so quickly that it's really quite crazy. So when you're 5 or 6 or 7 years old, a day lasts forever. But now years pass by in your mind's eye incredibly quickly.
And
so I actually created the timing scale of lifetime astrology is logarithmic. It's a spiral. And that spiral starts from the time you're conceived, and it gets longer and longer and longer as you age through the life process. And it really reflects how we perceive the passage of time. So once again, we have like a sacred proportion, a sacred geometry that functions in time as well as in space.
But when you mention time and our perception of it and it appearing to be faster, is that simply our perception of the time, or is that the way time actually is? Because if we are sitting in the same room with a 5-year-old, their day seems longer. That is their perception of the time.
Well, but see, it's called biological time because the time, as many people have pointed out, if you read kind of serious scientific books about time, that the time that a clock measures is not measuring time, it's measuring space.
Measuring space.
Because every
movement.
person and every living being perceives time in a different way. Like a child perceives time very differently than an adult. If you're 60 years old and you're around a 2-year-old, that 2-year-old has had like 4 meals in the course of a day and has run all around the house and has a boundless amount of energy, whereas, you know, it may be very difficult for you to get up and move out of the room. So the idea here is that every being has its own time sense. In fact, many people postulate that the Earth has its own time scale, and that the Milky Way galaxy has its time scale, and that the solar system and the universe itself have their time scales also. So it's very interesting once you make the leap to that time as well as...
Well, time is fascinating because time is motion. It really is motion, as you mentioned. When you look at the idea of time, do you think that time is increasing for all of us universally? Are we moving at a faster pace? Is the universe expanding at a faster pace?
Well, look at civilization. Look at population exploding. It's making a logarithmic scale, meaning it starts with very few people, and as you come closer to the present, the population is exploding.
Exponential.
Global warming is exponentially expanding. Population is, the amount of energy the planet uses, the amount of information because of the internet and these things. All of these things are accelerating exponentially right now.
And that is still based on that same...
It's the same geometric principle that governs the growth of a sunflower, the seeds, the seeds that surround the core of that sunflower, the pattern of those little oak clusters and so on, acorns.
Acorns, the lotus blossom opening and closing, all of them.
So the point is, not only do you see it in the visual world, in the material world, but you also sense it in the world of temporal phenomena.
How would people in their daily lives be able to appreciate sacred geometry?
Well, I mean, I've written books about it, and the whole idea is that it seems a lot more complex than it really is. And I do really believe that by trying to understand that, it gives us a different sense of how our time progresses through our lives. In fact, that's a reason why, in my way of looking at astrology, the reason why earlier events in life seem to be so powerful in terms of their influence is because we experienced them at a time when our time sense was incredibly drawn out, so it becomes incredibly
becomes
intense.
Much larger.
Right. So when you go back and really re-trigger or reactivate a very early childhood or gestation influence, you discover there's a huge amount of energy that may be trapped in your time field. And that by working with it psychotherapeutically or energetically or spiritually, it liberates that energy.
So it's concentrated at that point in time?
It can be, yeah. It's the farther back in life you go, the more energy is involved in every single action until you get to the moment of conception, which is like an explosion. In fact, it's said that the metaphor that the explosion of the sperm and egg and the energy happening, the kundalini energy of conception, is like a big bang.
The same thing.
It's a metaphor.
It's a metaphor, and in that moment of conception, we actually see the birth of all of the universe at the same time.
Exactly.
It's much the same process, and as we see when an atom splits or whatever, we get the same sort of response. So in that regard, the microcosm of the Earth, of the planet, of human being, is reflected in the macrocosm, and it's all of the same pattern evolving outwards.
Absolutely, and all of these patterns expand exponentially. Whatever proportion you use, they're all exponential proportions in the sense that
always speeding.
They're always accelerating, and they all have a core. And that it's I think even William Blake said that our life, conception is like the beginning of the universe, and death is like the end of the universe, because essentially we're repeating the entire creation of the universe within ourselves in one lifetime.
Right. And so that is a key component of it all. I think it's fascinating discovery. But as far as people understanding the way the logic of the universe works, it is all about sacred geometry. It's been an interesting discussion. We could go on forever. There's no question about it. My guest today has been Tad Mann, ATMann, ATMANN.net is his website. I encourage you to go there. His books are fabulous. Check him out on Amazon, and be sure to follow him for sure. And thank you very much, and we'll talk to you all in the next episode.